Hello, everyone. Hello, my name is Gilad Cohen, and I am going to be delivering this lecture/talk today about the Zionist imagination before the State of Israel, also titled The Clash of the Early Zionists. It might not be as violent as the title was advertised, but I hope we can all learn something today and come out of this talk thinking about the discussion of Zionism in the pre-state period as distinct from Zionism since the creation of the State of Israel, with an understanding of historical change and the fact that some of the earliest Zionist thinkers thought very differently about the state when compared to the current state that we see today, because that's typically how, I guess, historical processes develop. This is the opening page with a fun little ad for the Palestine Restoration Fund, led by the ZO, the Zionist organization in the United States. That was their local branch in the US. And it's, as you can tell, it does not say Medinat Israel or Eretz Israel, as those names had not been agreed upon as the name for the state. So even the name of the state hadn't been what it is today, nor agreed upon in the year 1919. But we're going to start a bit further back historically. But before we do so, and I'm going to ask for some audience participation here at Adams Street, if people are willing, and also in the comment section of the Zoom chat, if people would like to chime in and answer some of these questions, just so we could gain a sense of the listeners, the people in the room, what exactly we conceive of as a Jewish state, and also what sort of Jewish state, to your knowledge, did Herzl envision is sort of, I guess, our prototype or our ideal type of what an early Zionist intellectual looks like. So if there's anyone here who's interested in chiming in, please say something. That's very funny that you said that, because I was having a discussion earlier with Rustin and with Jeremy, and Rustin said the same thing. Jewish policemen arresting Jewish criminals. So there's this sense that the Jewish state, the early Jewish state, would be comprised of individuals who were all Jewish, and it didn't matter what your position in society was, rich, poor, criminal, policeman, you'd be part of a Jewish commonwealth, a Jewish society. Are there any views here to that same question, or maybe for people who are more familiar with Herzl's ideas, if you have any ideas as to the second question? Luis.
The kind of Zionism which Hassan was proposing. So, because that I understood that Herzl was proposing mainly like a secular Zionism, where I suppose like the idea was that there would be like a state for the Jewish nation, but not necessarily connected to Jewish like spiritual or religious values.
Yeah, that's definitely a really important point to bring forward. Hopefully those of you on Zoom heard that, but Luis just brought up the fact that Herzl was not as concerned about the Jewish cultural character per se of the state, or I should say the religious Jewish cultural character of the state, but instead the ethnic makeup of the Jewish state. So it was a place where Jews could go as a safe haven, but for Herzl, the Jewish state would speak German. That would be the language of the state. It would be financed by wealthy individuals from Austria-Hungary, and it would be heavily steeped in secular European German imperial culture, and that's very important. We have a comment from the comment section, and I think they're titled as participant, but I have a feeling it's my grandfather, because he knows, because he's saying exactly what I probably told him already, which is sort of a spoiler alert. So the other participants, it's okay. We just got a message. I'll speak on behalf of the participants who are in the room. I'll repeat their questions as I just did. So don't worry about hearing the other participants. But yeah, the person who said, as I understand it, the Judenstaat of Herzl was to be a sub-state of the Ottoman Empire rather than totally independent. Wow, hit the nail on the head. And we'll discuss why that is. the complexities of that idea as we make sense of Herzl's thought alongside some other Zionist founders such as Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion. We have another comment. A Jewish state should be a democracy and be predominantly Jewish, but open to all. Should be pluralistically Jewish in terms of religion, basically secular or chiloni, rather than dati. So it's a state run by secular authorities and democratic, which is very interesting that Ellen just Jaffe Gill gave us this comment. It's an interesting contribution because Jewish in some ways is categorically religious. So to say that a Jewish state ought to be secular and democratic, I think this is the tension that Israel is dealing with to this day and why it has such an identity crisis. And we'll discuss some of these ideas moving forward as we go through this PowerPoint together. So I wanted to discuss and these sort of points which comprise the early 2000s view of Zionism. I want to describe this as sort of the backdrop to which some of the more recent ideas that I'll explore are responding to. So this is really the mainstay literature on the history of Zionism as an intellectual movement and also a political movement, but these books mainly focus on Jewish intellectual developments. So historians including Shlomo Avineri, who wrote The Making of Modern Zionism, personally my favorite of these three texts, and Anita Shapira, she wrote Israel History, and Gidon Shimoni's The Zionist Ideology. They all ascribe to a similar view of the Jewish state, which assumes these 3 points that you can read here, and that I'm sure some of you have already read, that pre-Israeli state Zionists were unified in their desire to build a national homeland for the Jewish nation. So already here, there's some assumptions, right? The Jewish people should not be living in the diaspora. They should have their own homeland, whether or not that is on the basis of religious arguments or on the basis of just being treated like every other nation of the world it depends on which thinker. But broadly speaking, they all think that Jews should have their own place to call home, and that the Jews are a nation, that they can be denoted as a nation rather than simply a religion. And Mizrahi Zionists, who are the early religious Zionists, obviously thought that Jews had a very strong obligation to uphold halacha and to establish a Jewish state in not only a religiously legal manner, but also in a manner which is true to the spiritual tradition of Judaism. But even despite these religious, spiritual, cultural undertones, Mizrahi still saw the Jews as a nation. So it's a nation that's also a religion, a people that's also got spiritual beliefs. And, there's other scholars who are Jewish nationalists who say to be Jew is to be part of a Jewish family. So it's one big family is what makes the Jews a people. So the Zionists broadly thought the Jews are a nation. And the second point is that the national homeland would be in Palestine. Now, some of you may have heard about the Uganda plan or the Argentina plan, which were proposed from the 4th to 7th Zionist congresses taking place in the early 20th century. But those were rejected. They were minority opinions. They were never accepted. There was never actually a colonization fund for colonies in any of these places. It was rather ideas that were proposed and they were not so broadly held. The research currently that some of the more recent scholars will look at who push back against these books and these figures, they broadly accept these 2 first points. It's this third point where things start to get different and we start to move into sort of a new direction in the study of Zionism in the past, I would say, 8 years. And that's the state built in that national homeland would then belong to the Jewish nation. It would be a Jewish nation state. So the participant who said before that the Jewish state would be a sub-state of the Ottoman Empire, according to Herzl, would then disagree. If that was Herzl's view, then that does not cohere with this notion that the Jewish state would be a nation state. Because a nation state supposes that there is no higher state administration above that of the nation. The state, the political administration belongs to the nation. And more or less, this is what these three books propose. But as we've started to see, this might not be the case, especially in light of that idea of sub-state sovereignty within a broader empire. We also have some comments going on in the chat, and I can't read them all along as I go, but we have one question along the way that I will get to toward the end once it's question period. So if you still have questions, feel free, and comments as well, feel free to put them in the comment section, and I'll get to them at the end of the talk. And also there will be opportunities for more comment contributions later throughout the talk. So now we come to one of those times, and we've already sort of anticipated this, so we don't need to talk too much about what might be missing to these depictions, because luckily we had that participant who helped us out understand why there might be an anachronism, or sort of reading contemporary politics onto earlier history, trying to understand early ideas of what a Jewish state would look like in light of the Jewish state, Medinat Israel, today. So if someone has any contributions that they'd like to make about what sort of anachronisms might lie in the previous slide that we were talking about with respect to the Jewish nation state, I think we've addressed it so far. But if there's any other anachronisms that people think about, yeah, Danny, for sure. That's a really important question. I think within the context of Jewish nationalism, right, Jews are more or less a nation. So Zionism is a type of Jewish nationalism developing at the time, but really there's all sorts of different Jewish nationalisms, such as Jewish socialism, which see Jews as a nation as well, and the Bund, which is a weird sort of anti-Zionist, somewhat socialist, Yiddishist labor organization that wanted to develop an independent sort of Jewish socialist commonwealth. And I think it's difficult because, you know, even within our liturgy, it's Bnei Yisrael, or Am Yisrael, the children of Israel, the nation of Israel. It does seem that if Jews are a religion, they're also a nation. I don't know of people, intellectual figures, who outright rejected national connotations to the Jewish people. There were obviously, like, Agudat Israel focused predominantly on religiosity and halacha, and the brit between Bnei Israel and Hashem, between the children of Israel and God. So these groups, they don't emphasize the national characteristics as much as the more secular characters, but I wouldn't say that they reject the national character altogether, because being part of the Jewish people has a national undertone that is hard to shake off. So like, yeah, Achad Ha'am saw Israel would be the sort of spiritual center of the Jewish nation. And so again, you have this idea of a culture that's being preserved, but culture isn't to exclude nation. So I think that a lot of the Jews at this time are not rejecting the category of nation, but thinking about what it means to be a nation very differently. Yeah, so that's actually a key point that I totally forgot. And we're not really talking much about reform at all, because reform, obviously, but in the period that we're discussing, they were anti-Zionist. But you're totally right. Rustin is correct. Reform assumed that they accepted the title of religion and excluded the title of nation. Thank you for pointing that out, because I shouldn't have forgotten that. But it is true, because there was an idea that there is a morally universal characteristic. This is like figures like Abraham Geiger and the Hamburg Temple, who created the initial reforms. They propose that the truth of Judaism does not lie in its folkways, in its rituals, in its sort of idiosyncratic Jewish cultural elements. It lied in its moral truth. And there was a core moral truth that we could sort of find within all of the, you know, schmaltz, or all of the fat, which is Judaism, all of the different layers of Judaism. There's ultimately a moral core, and that's what we need to hold on to, and we can sort of get rid of the rest. And yeah, it was the acceptance of religious identity, because being a nation within the German state was seen as sort of, yeah, suspect, because Jews living in that state would then be thought to maybe revolt against Germany if they wanted to develop their own nation. So yeah, within the context of this turn of the century, I would say, Rustin, that was a great point. Reform is probably the major, and I can't currently think of another movement who really strongly rejects that identifier. Yes.
Yeah, what about like the current discussion, I guess, the like similar belonging to a nation state, whether it's remaining a people but assimilating into a broad Gentile culture like the assimilationists, and then people like Reform who assert this sort of moral binding character and maintain, oh, that's what Jewish peoplehood sort of means to become a separate part. Sort of, it may be somewhat close to the assimilationist school, but oh, yeah, religions are a private affair. We're not going to sort of maintain it as our own. Because then, I liked your use of the word idiosyncratic, because that's this implicit notion of like, oh, what we do is weird compared to the broader German society in which we're living. So we need to sort of move in that direction.
So totally right. I think that there's this interesting correspondence between the assimilationists and the religionists, let's call them, Reform and assimilationism. And these are also influenced by, someone in the chat brought up a very important point as well. Stephen Arnold said, are these 19th century thinkers influenced by the assembly of Jewish notables who redefined Jews as only a religious group whose nation was France? This is a very important point as well, because in France, after Napoleon had basically built up his empire and started to toy with the idea of emancipation for Jews, there's a famous statement by Clermont-Tonnerre, who's this famous sort of French politician, who stated the Jews should be given everything as individuals and nothing as a nation. So that doesn't reject the idea that Jews were a nation, but it rejects the idea that the Jews should maintain a nation through this project of modernity. That Jews, if they want to be full citizens, have to sort of drop this national characteristic and baggage, and like Seth said, do Judaism in the home, but not in public. So these are some important points. They're kind of tangential, because ultimately we're talking about Jewish nationalism, and Zionism is one of those types. But thank you all for chiming in, because it's been really helpful to get a much broader sense of the sort of ideas developing at the time. And yes, Rabbi David Cooper, correctly, the leaders of the French Jewish community affirmed to Napoleon that Judaism was only religion. This is true. Napoleon headed he called it the Sanhedrin, and this was a Jewish council of notables who wanted full emancipation, but it wasn't so easy. It was not a result of the Sanhedrin that they were given emancipation, even though Jews basically gave up their national characteristics on that sort of elite level. Okay, so now we are moving on to the problematic aspects of what we were talking about before. We're moving away from Reform back to Jewish nationalism and discussing the work specifically of one figure who's influenced the literature very prominently. His name is Dmitry Shumsky. He's a scholar at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and he wrote a book that I have found extremely illuminating. If anybody's interested, you should pick it up as well. And he really questions this nation-statist logic in the context of Zionism prior to the creation of the state, especially Zionism prior to the First World War, because this is a watershed moment where all of these massive multinational empires begin to collapse. So he interestingly argues that both committed Zionists and anti-Zionists accept this flawed framing where was thought of by people like Herzl as a nation state. He says that it seems anachronistic considering the imperial context that I highlighted before, and he provides what I consider a persuasive argument, because he places these intellectuals in their context of this multi-imperial space, and in doing so, he brings forward a lot of these primary source documents that haven't been looked at, and he looks at documents that have been looked at in new light, which makes us think, I think, critically about this former narrative. And many of the mainstay scholars of Zionism and Israel, again, both on the left and on the right, anti-Zionists like Daniel Boyarin, and more centrist scholars like Derek Pensler at Harvard and Yuval Ivri, Brandeis, who I actually should say thank you to because he's the one who told me I should read this book. They all accept this framing. Independent of their political orientation, they see that there's utility in reading historical documents in this way. And so we're talking about this imperial space. And so as a result, I wanted to give a little clarification because these terms are quite loaded and sometimes they're used in very specific contexts. And when we're using it academically, or I guess historically even, we should be careful to ensure that we're trying at least to understand the imperialism that Chomsky is talking about, which is in the yellow bubble, from the colonialism, the blue bubble, which is also arguably a part of the early Zionist imaginary, but Chomsky isn't looking at that, and I'm not going to focus on that either. Instead, I'm going to focus on imperialism, which refers to a state influencing the production and distribution of resources through economic and political influence. It's a bit clunky, but it basically means there's some administrative apparatus which influences the way people produce their goods in some place. You know, that's why some people would call it neo-imperialism, that the US imposes certain structural adjustment programs on countries all throughout the world because there's a political and economic relationship. Is it considered neo-colonialism? That's a different question and probably a harder one to stand on. Colonialism is a process of one polity occupying a separate one with settlers who then exploit economic resources. This is beyond a structural adjustment program. This is an American family coming to move into your neighborhood and they start cutting down all the trees and you're thinking, what's going on? And then imperial colonialism is simply, I guess, tied to colonialism, but it also recognizes that there is an imperial element because there can hypothetically be colonialism without some imperial capital if you settle colonies and start exploiting resources. But yeah, imperial colonialism is the direct rule of an empire over other territories. There's both colonies and this managerial process taking place from some metropole. And we'll quickly look now to some more of framing before we get to a discussion of these Zionist thinkers who I wanted to bring forward to make sense of the importance of Chomsky's argument and this newer literature. And like I said before, Chomsky is interested in imperialism. We've talked about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. These are the three major empires of the turn of the century, which Jews are living in great number in all three of them. The vast majority of Jews are living in all three of them together, especially in the Russian Empire, in what is called the Pale of Settlement in areas of contemporary Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland, and thinkers like Herzl, Jabotinsky, and Ben-Gurion, who we're going to look at shortly, lived in these empires. And they thought about politics in light of these empires, and they thought about a Jewish state in light of the empires which controlled the sort of map at the time. And that's why I included this ethno-religious breakdown of the Russian Empire, because you can see that there's all of these different national groups, and it's not really a nation state, right? This is an empire with many different states and or governorates, as they were called at the time. And yeah, it's not such a homogenous state where just Russians live in Russia, only speaking Russian. And interestingly, around this time, the Litvaks or the Lithuanians living in Lithuania were speaking Lithuanian as like a second language, but because the imperial language was Russian, most Lithuanians were speaking Russian on a daily basis. So it's interesting to think that the identity was not as stuck as it is today, given the fact that Lithuania has become then a nation state, its own Lithuanian nation state. But these identities were more fluid as language and empire influenced the sort of cultural boundaries. And the Pale of Settlement is this border right there. And all the green dots, those are the Jews. So we'll get to Herzl, our first Zionist hero / intellectual. And in his work, Altneuland, the Jewish state, like our participant said, is actually seen as a province of the Ottoman Empire, financially afloat thanks to Habsburg financiers. This is something interesting in Chomsky's work, is that he looks at Altneuland as not a separate political project from Judenstadt. but the logical conclusion of developing a Jewish state. People typically disregard Alt Neuland as being a document you can understand political theory from. And even if they do, it's dismissed, like Shlomo Avineri says, it's clearly a nation state which is proposed. But Chomsky reads it very differently, and I think quite accurately, based on a quote that we'll see right there, and then subsequent quotes which will make us think about how maybe Alt Neuland was a document wherein Herzl laid out his Judenstaat more fully, rather than a separate project entirely. And so the state's old new character, which is where the Alt Neu comes from, or the old new land, is a commitment to international cosmopolitanism rather than nation state as sovereignty. So the new element is in light of these new multinational imperial spaces, not the new nation states. Because, Herzl did not live to see the Second World War. He did not live to see the collapse of these imperial spaces. So Herzl, of the three figures we're going to look at, always held this opinion throughout his life, more or less. He was, throughout his life, not a nation statist. Whereas Ben Gurion and Jabotinsky, they changed their minds. And so, like I said before, I'll read this quote first because it's quite interesting. A state is formed not by pieces of land, but rather by a number of men united under sovereign rule. Right? So there's a sense that there's a level of sovereignty which the people of this land can have, but it's not the piece of land itself which gives people that state character. And so we can think of that interestingly, because if you have lots of Jews living in some imperial context, like the Ottoman Empire, for instance, they need not live specifically in Judea or whatever province it would have been called under Herzl's imagination. They could simply live throughout the empire, and because they're connected to this national identity, they comprise this sovereign unit. And so Jews would have citizen rights independent of whether they lived in Judea or not. And like I said before, state used in the case of the Czech Republic or Czechia was used contemporaneous with Herzl's writing to denote a sub-state sovereign unit in Czechoslovakia rather than state being a nation state. So just because it's called Judenstaat does not mean that it's Juden-Nationstaat. And here's an interesting quote that Herzl had on page 178 of Alt Neuland. Only when the Jews forming the majority in Palestine showed themselves to be tolerant were they shown more toleration in all other countries. Very weird quote to look at, because whether or not Jews are showing toleration in Palestine, Jews are not being tolerated in all other countries, and that I think we can all agree on. So something's going on. But on to our next figure in the intellectual history of Zionism. This is Zeb Jabotinsky. Do we have someone in the room who's familiar with Jabotinsky and his significance over the course of Zionist history? Yeah, Seth?
Yeah, so I think importantly, Jabotinsky is the father of revisionist Zionism, which is a more sort of, I would call it, more conservative or right-wing, but more importantly, I think more like military-focused form of Zionism, where Jewish state, peoplehood and statehood is very much grounded in like the use and establishment of Jewish military power and sovereign power to enforce Jewish safety and security.
Yeah, so he was definitely a strong military leader. He was not a military leader in the Palmach, which was the mainstream Zionist organization military wing. He was the leader of a paramilitary group called the Irgun, the leader of a youth organization called Beitar, and an intellectual leader of revisionist Zionism. In many ways, he is the ideological founder of right-wing and far-right Zionism. He's influenced leaders like Menachem Begin and also people on the far right who can be considered much more nefarious actors like Meir Kahane, who have inspired terrorist attacks and who are far more right-wing and problematic. But also there are some more, I guess, less far-right, less alt-right figures who also take Jabotinsky extremely seriously, and his views and the way they developed show, I guess, a sense amongst many early Zionist figures that there was an arrogance to think that such a multinational polity could exist because of the state of affairs taking place leading up to the Holocaust, which Jabotinsky foresaw before it even happened, and then the struggle to build a state needed to come at the cost of others for Jabotinsky. And if that was not done, we don't know what the outcome would be, but we know because there was mass displacement of Arab communities living in Israel, a state was able to form for the Jews. Did it have to happen this way? I don't think so, but I also don't know. So yeah, he was a pre-World War I figure when he wrote his earliest writings, which propose this binationalism that we also saw in Herzl. And so in his revisionist paper, Rasvit, he cites the future Palestine must be founded legally speaking as a binational state, and not just Palestine. Every land that has an ethnic minority of even the smallest kind would need, after all, according to our deeply held views, to adopt its legal regime to the fact and become tri-national, or quadranational. So this is very different from how his writing develops 15 years later, where he's outright rejecting this. And such is the case when he eventually abandons this idea in his work, The Jewish War Front. He declares the failure of such a program and advocates for the forced displacement of Arab communities living in what was at the time Palestine. And he argued famously just 1 year or 3 years before he wrote The Jewish War Front, he argued against the Peel Commission, which would create separate Arab and Jewish sovereign states with potentially without some overarching administration, presumably because he thought, no, we could still have one overarching state for these two peoples. But obviously he does not think that by 1939, and surely he does not think that as he is leading the Irgun in the early Yishuv. Yes. Yeah, so that's a great question. So we just had the question, what's meant by the term revisionist Zionism? I think for Jabotinsky, he was trying to revise the ideas that were very mainstream within the Yishuv, the new Yishuv. So the new settlement in Palestine at the time. Palestine was typically led by socialists who were part of the kibbutz movement, who wanted to allow for agricultural development in the region, and who thought that commitments to, minority rights and social justice should be part and parcel of the Zionist project. And that was the movement to which Ben-Gurion was coming out of. But he wanted to revise this conception and also this view of history where, the culmination of the Jewish people would come to be either this sort of socialist commune state or this more, I guess, mainstream democratic state. In his later writings, he also admired Mussolini and thought that it's possible to erect a Jewish fascist state. He wanted to revise what might be considered to him the naivetes of this sort of leftism. And we can discuss Jabotinsky after as well. So here we have David Ben-Gurion, who's doing a headstand on the beach. This photo belongs to the National Library of Israel. And I spelled his name wrong. Yeah, so prior to the Holocaust, Ben-Gurion's political thought looked quite different from how he established Medinat Yisrael, or the State of Israel. And Ben-Gurion, within the literature, is one of those figures who is thought of as a pragmatist. And I think that contemporarily and in the past sort of 30 years, that view has been agreed upon still. His political view, he wasn't like a staunch Marxist socialist. He was a leader of the Jewish people and adopted the ideological principles which he saw could help them develop a Jewish state. And so we don't know how strongly he believed in the idea of a binationalism. I think for Ben-Gurion, from the way Chomsky analyzes him, at least, it seems that he adopted this binationalism because it would be the most politically expedient way to develop the state. And as soon as the world started to look like a world filled with nation states, he adopted the most expedient way to build a state, which would be a nation state. And so he argued for the creation of a Palestine with two cultural autonomies in Eretz Yisrael, just as it was in the Mandate era or in the era of Turkish rule. He writes this in a newspaper prior to the creation of the state and prior to the Holocaust, because like Jabotinsky, he has a change of heart after these events and sort of develops new ideas. From 1936, he discussed building the state potentially as a sub-state of some broader Arab federation. there's a lot of ideas being thrown out, and I think this coheres well with our notion of David Ben-Gurion as a pragmatist, and the link between nation and state as it becomes stronger. There's sort of these mass migrations taking place in both Turkey and Greece, where these are becoming more solidified in their ethnic homogeneity. And so Ben-Gurion, following the Holocaust, realized, okay, if we're scattered amongst the nations and we don't have a state like any others, how can we trust some other political administration greater than us to secure our foundation? So he adapts to the times and adopts this ethno-national Jewish state model. So these are our three major figures. I'm going to take yeah.
Is the Arab world, is that what's happening on that?
That's a great question. I don't have enough information to give you a solid answer. To my knowledge, their Sultan and David Ben-Gurion had a relationship, and so he was trying to sort of lobby the Ottoman Empire in its early stages for the development of a Jewish state, which didn't happen. So the Sultan was obviously not in favor of it. And I don't know about the rest of the Arab world. My intuition is that it would not be a popular idea, especially with the Arab violence against Jews taking place and proliferating throughout the 1930s, in light of the Peel Commission really comes as a response to a lot of this Arab anti-Jewish violence. And so, yeah, it would seem that it was definitely not an idea being proposed by intellectuals, but I can't say that definitively, nor with great confidence. But yeah, that's my sense. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I didn't look at Golda Meir in this, and neither did Chomsky, which is interesting. That's something I should think about, because maybe there's not enough. Yeah. I'm just.
That they can more effectively approach the Sultan and other Ottoman authorities, better work with it. So I think that can also be an interesting example of showing that Ben-Gurion's he was tactical about how he chose to approach a very practical solution or work within the system of the state too.
Yeah, there's some Zionists who were very ideologically committed to binationalism. One of them founded the Brandeis Near Eastern Judaic Studies program, Shimon Ravidovich. It was an ideological impulse that he wanted to have this binational Jewish Arab state, Israel, Palestine, whatever it be called. But I think for Ben-Gurion, like you said, he wanted a Jewish state, and it didn't really matter how it was going to be developed. It just mattered that we needed to be able to secure a homeland, because the case was so insecure and it was a scramble to save Jews. And then post-Holocaust, it was like, it's already too late. The fact that we don't have a state it's enough. And so that's where I think his expediency came into play, and why he was Israel's first prime minister, because he wanted to get the job done. And he was, sort of a technocrat, more autocrat style government. I mean, he led basically unopposed for 30 years, built the country, or his party led unopposed. He didn't lead for 30 years, but the Labor did. Yeah. Okay, so now I was interested in if anybody thought that this most recent analysis had some potential flaws. Do you find this sort of depiction of these figures reflecting an extensive research of Zionist archival sources persuasive, or are there elements that might not be so persuasive? I've sort of presented it as quite definitive almost, but yeah. Well, he was the lead. He was the leader of the Poalet Zion, right? And that was the socialist Zionists. And Israel to this day plays both Russia and the US, and they receive funding from both countries and have diplomatic ties with both countries. And I think obviously the United States is Israel's biggest fan. It's sort of undisputable. But I do think that maybe there was some sort of soft power at play where the Soviet Union thought that if they were able to maintain diplomatic ties with Israel, that this could be a security advantage, because they wouldn't necessarily have to, develop some military conflict with Israel in the region or could use them to their advantage. But you're right, like it does seem odd. Clearly, the style of government that did develop was not Soviet. It certainly had a kibbutznik socialist elements to the early state. It's it's difficult to think that the leadership at the time of the USSR wouldn't have thought like, maybe we're giving too much money to this US proxy. So that's a good question. I don't know. It's hard. It's hard to think because also Israel never entrenched a constitution. It was politically ambiguous for many years. And it did still have socialist elements, but great question. And I don't think I have a clear answer for it. Okay. So I guess I'll say what I think Chomsky is missing, if anything. And there's a lot of talk of Jewish states and Jewish statism, or how the Jews can be a state like any other. But I'm interested in how the Jews developed their politics historically in communication with and independent of states like any other. Because the Jewish diasporic political tradition is in itself a mode of organization that existed. And thanks to the Zionist movement, it became increasingly global. But there was an existing infrastructure from various kehilot, and which were the community kahal, which was an organization which oversaw many legal jurisdictions for the Jews living in the kahal, but also dealt with matters that would impede upon what might be considered like, secular law, monetary disputes within the community. So there was political power that then sort of transferred into these early national movements. And I'm interested then in asking this about the diasporic Jewish polity and its influence over early Zionism, right? So beyond the nation state, the nationality state, which is this multi-state, or the federation state, like, Ben-Gurion's Arab Federation with a little Israel on the side. I'm interested in asking, how did the Zionists appropriate and transform the Jewish diaspora polity? There was some sort of connected polity existing, which a World Zionist organization was to mobilize en masse. And I'm interested in looking at different case studies of different areas of imperial influence, where we might be able to say, okay, there were lots of empires at play, but we can see more or less how they influenced Jewish communities in their political mobilization. And if we can control for that effect in any way, distilling the specifically Jewish political element, can we see that in the writing of these early figures as well? So what I want to do with my dissertation, I don't know if I explained this at the beginning, but I'm a doctoral student. I'm beginning my PhD at Brandeis. I would like to build some case studies in these regions of imperial interaction, and I have 3 in mind currently. One would be in Montreal, an area of imperial periphery with respect to the British and the French, but also mass Russian migration taking place on a massive scale, or I should say Pale of Settlement migration, because it's not simply Jews who were Russian speaking, but Jews under Tsarist control. And this would also be at the turn of the century period before the First World War, and then in between the wars, and potentially look at the way in which the fall of these multinational empires also influenced the Jewish diaspora polity. But these ideas are still very new and fresh, and so I'm happy to take any comments at the end about some ideas, maybe if this is too ambitious or if it's not ambitious enough, anything that people are interested in asking. So the sort of analysis that this would look at is called connected history. And rather than dividing the world into different imperial blocks, I want to look at archives of different contexts in one context. So going to understand Russian migration in a Canadian archive, going to understand what's going on in the Yishuv between, an Ottoman Sultan in Vienna, and trying to understand this Jewish polity between empires and trying to break down imperial influence as the sort of broadest mode of analysis in favor of one which looks at Jews really who are migrating at this time constantly, chain migration patterns, but also intellectuals moving from one center of Jewish urban politics to another, thanks to, many of the late industrial developments beyond steam, taking trains, allowing Jews to access different centers much more easily. And yeah, my first context that I've looked at and that I've presented on and that I will present on is the Montreal and the Canadian Jewish Congress. It was a parliament of Jews, which, as you can see here, when there's this exponential or near exponential growth of or population growth, the Congress convenes. So in many of these contexts, it's because of this population boom and these migrations that that Jews start to expand their political infrastructure throughout the diaspora. And here you can also see sort of a geographical breakdown of the electoral results of the First Canadian Jewish Congress. One of the most interesting things I think to note is these black bubbles, with this bubble representing about 200 votes, 200 delegates, my apologies, 200 delegates, which is, tens of thousands of votes, and which displays overall that there was a almost like 30,000 Jews turn out for vote, and with like the average family size at the time being 6 to 7 members, and the amount of Jews living in Canada at the time being just over 100,000, it means like the overwhelming majority of adults who are living in Canada were voting in this. And the vast majority of them were not born in Canada. They were migrating from the Pale of Settlement. As we've seen here, the community up until 1900 is about 20,000, and by Congress's convening, it's like 115. So really mass migration where everybody's turning up to vote. And it's not that these are people who are so concerned about Canadianness per se. They're so concerned about global Jewish issues. And that's the analysis that I give of the Congress, which can be a substantive here. And I look to do similar analyses with other diasporic centers and contrast that with the early Yishuv and its patterns of political organization. Again, still in early stages, but that's my idea for my future project. And yes, all that's left to say is thank you. So thank you. Okay. We've got some thank yous. We had some great questions. There's been lots of people talking in the comments, which is great. Some people some comments that sound like, oh, maybe I was saying some things incorrectly, which is very likely and possible. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming. And I truly enjoyed giving this talk. And yeah, I'm just sort of, there's early on, there's a lot of discussion here. There was, is there a difference between Zionism before 1920? And this is from Ellen Jaffe, Jaffe, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce her name. And she asks, is there a difference between Zionism before 1920 and Zionism at the time of independence? I hope you will address this before you finish. So I hope that did come clear, because I did say that the fin du siècle, or the turn of the century, was a time that looked very different from the motives of independence. We can see that just between Herzl and Ben Gurion, the two great Zionist fathers, right? As some would call them, like Ben-Zion Netanyahu. They have entirely different views of what the Jewish state looks like, because post 1920, and I think we're really talking post Treaty of Versailles, which is post collapse of the multi-imperial space, very different world. It's a world of Jewish nation states rather than multinational empires. And so that I hope I addressed that. There's people who were talked about the Bund in the 19th century, assemblies, the notables in France we talked about. There's some comments about Jabotinsky said the Jordan has 2 banks. He wanted a Jewish state extending into Transjordan. I don't know what date that's from. Like I said before, in the early 30s, Jabotinsky still held out on belief for a potentially binational state, but it was outright rejected in full only in 1939. Martin Buber was against a Jewish nation state. Buber opposed the Jewish nation state idea largely because it would be oppressive to the Palestinian Arabs. He did organize Brit Shalom and Ichud to oppose the idea of Jewish state. All correct. I'm up to the neck with you. Okay, here's an interesting question. I'm up to my neck with people who insist Zionism was a settler colonialist scheme from the 1880s on. What do I say to these people? My feeling is that early Zionism, even with different schools of thought, was more idealistic and open to coexistence with Arabs, and it was the Shoah that changed everything. Please address this. Yeah, I think I did address that. I think that was more or less the thrust of the talk. So yeah, you can tell them that they're reading history anachronistically. Thank you for sharing. No, it didn't. I don't know what. Okay. Can you talk about Buber Magnuson's sold opposition to a Jewish nation state? I'm not as familiar with the Brit Shalom politics of the day, but I do know that, yeah, their influence was definitely beyond the idea of a single Jewish nation state. And like I said before about Shimon Rabidovich, there was a concerted effort to have Arab national rights, so not only individual citizenship rights, but within this one state, there would be Arab national and Jewish national rights, as well as citizenship rights. Yes. Yeah, I think it's the question of the nation state, right? And it's in the title of his book too, Beyond the Nation State, right? So the idea of a nation state is that the state belongs to the nation and its citizenry. And the idea of a multinational imperial state is that the state belongs to the empire and the nations have rights that they're allotted to the empire, from the empire. So in the early multinational imperial space, it doesn't seem like Jews were advocating to have a state that was homogeneously Jewish, where the citizens would ultimately lead the political administrative apparatus. It's that they'd be granted rights from a larger political entity, which would also grant rights to other groups.
So he was saying that.
Exactly. Yeah. Which is sort of what we see in the quotes. Oh, we're getting some more comments. Okay. Was really early Zionism more idealistic or wasn't it? I would say yes, because the political reality of building paramilitary and military groups is not idealistic. So yeah, definitely.
Yiddish, right? Reacting to anti-Semitism in Europe in the 19th century. And if you just move the Jews from subjugation under this empire to subjugation under that empire, how do you solve the big problem? Isn't that the traditional read? Is that you need autonomy in order to be safe?
This is a very fair point. And I think that Herzl was not only advocating, and this comes out in his documents, and you're right, that there was a sense of a lack of confidence in a place like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because it wasn't the Austro-Hungarian Jewish Empire, right? Had Jews been given the political rights of an entrenched national minority, maybe then they would have been secure. But Jews were never given emancipation in Russia. They were granted emancipation in Vienna, but didn't have national rights. And then in Ottoman Palestine, they were given sort of, citizenship rights like other groups, but again, no national rights. So it's really the discourse of national rights, which is the chidush, which I'd say it's not like Herzl came up with the idea of national rights. He was piggybacking on many other figures. And you're right to say that it's like we're going from one empire to another. But it was more that the Jews would establish maybe, like the Israeli-Palestinian state or the Israel-Palestine state rather than Israel.
Was someone opposed to the founding of Israel on the religious grounds? They were concerned that the mitzvot and the actual religion would be kept properly there, and that figures it all at the end of this conversation.
Yeah, you're. Can you say that one more time? The Chaim Potok's argument about halacha and
He portrays the Orthodox Jewish characters who are actually opposed to it before Israel's formed. Change it, but who were opposed to the formation of Israel because I think they were concerned it wouldn't be done.
Yeah. These are. I guess is that I haven't read this book, so is it a sort of like passive versus realistic messianism,
I
or
think it's meant to be a realistic portrayal of what was happening.
yeah. Yeah, there was. I mean, the Agudat Yisrael opposed the idea of, like establishing the secular state in place of the existing old yeshuv, right? Jews, hypothetically, there's no like ongoing record. Jews have hypothetically lived in Israel undisturbed since the destruction of the first temple. We know that by the time that Zionism starts to develop as a movement, you already have Jews living in Hebron, in Yerushalayim, in all of the holy cities, right? And so those Jews who were living in these cities, who had already established their own religious authority over their communities, were definitely threatened politically by a secular state that would be able to oversee their holy sites where they were living. And yeah, in terms of what you brought up, Barry, the idea of this passive messianism is also extremely influential over contemporary anti-Zionist Hasidist groups and Hasidim in general, even what would seem to be Zionist Hasidim, for instance, Chabad is one of these instances of very pro-Israel Hasidim, still are very standoffish when it's a discussion of Medinat Yisrael versus Am Yisrael and Klal Yisrael, right? So like the state of Israel is always suspect, but the nation of Israel living in the state, that's what's so amazing, is the mass migration. The actual institutions of government, we can be critical of them. But when it comes to the people, that's really, we're seeing the Messianic age come to life. Undisturbed except for the Crusades. This is very true. Were there any Jews who remained in Israel upon the Crusades? I couldn't. Yeah, like I said before, I don't think the documents we would have to either refute or corroborate such a claim that Jews have lived undisturbed. But there were Jews by the 18th century and 19th centuries who had established communities, and they were halachically observant. Okay, amazing. So yes, lots of positive feedback in the Zoom, and we'll have this recording at some time in the near future, and we can share it on the Shul YouTube. And thank you all so much for coming, and please come anytime to visit Adams Street Shul. I am currently a member and a huge fan. It's very Hamish and welcoming, and I thank the Adams Street Shul for giving me this opportunity to present my research. So thank you so much. A special thank you to Barry, our president, and to Rustin, Jeremy, and Jordan, who are not here, who have helped me along the way set this up, do tech rehearsal, and have given me this platform to speak. And also to all of you for coming and showing interest in a topic which I care so deeply about. And yeah, thank you. Have a nice day.